Thank you very much, Alex. I've known of LSE for a long time, seen it as having a very high reputation, high regard, and was very pleased that I actually was in touch with somebody here now, and I could ask him whether I could visit. So that's how this came about. I have done a lot of my scholarly work as a philosopher in the last 35 years in philosophy of health economics, philosophical questions about health economics, including pretty intricate methodological questions about qualities at the point, etc. So I have worked on issues in economics, especially methodological ones in health economics, but I am not an economist, and there are occasionally things that I just don't absorb, haven't absorbed, and I can make some big mistakes at times when I refer to an economic principle. So forgive me if I do any of that today. Today is my talk is I think, a very philosophical one. I hope is of interest to economists. It certainly is to those who are trying to measure health benefit. Because one of the big elements in measuring health benefit is what is the value of life saved as distinct from quality of life improvement. And that's all the whole quality business came about, trying to get those on a scale, etc. Leave that whole topic entirely alone. I'm not going to deal with that at all. I'm simply going to ask, what is the subjective value of life? Now, why the subjective value? Well, it's the value of life to the person whose life it is. To the person whose life it is. Not to anybody else. And it's not objective things about that life that you can say are attributes of that person. That's not the value of life to the person whose life it is. It's subjectively to that person what is the value of life. So it's value of life to the person whose life it is. It's endemic in the outlook of conscious, self-conscious persons. I don't think you can be a person without having a notion of a subjective value. It's morally and socially central, though not the only important value life has. Certainly, its loss, the loss of the value of life to the person whose life it is a fundamental reason, if not the only reason. It's not the only reason, but it's a fundamental reason why death is bad. Why shouldn't I just murder you if I don't like you? You have a life that's yours, and it's valuable to you. That's the first reason I shouldn't do that. And it ties in with political cultures in the United States, famous declaration, line of Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. My direct focus is on what subjective value of life is, value of life to the person whose life it is. It's not on often very much related moral questions about saving lives and preventing death. I'm just trying to get straight what the subjective value of life is. Now, there's a lot of skepticism in this talk. The first 40% will be my view, which does not look skeptical at all. The second section will be my skepticism about whether this view ends up enabling us to say, discern anything very clear about the subjective value of life. And then the third section will be trying to recoup some value for public policy amidst that skepticism about whether we can ever really be clear what the value, subjective value of life is. Conceptually, not what I will call the substantive components or elements of the subjective value of life, but conceptually, what is it when we refer to this thing I'm calling the subjective value of life? First of all, it's subjective value, as has been noted, value of life to the person whose life it is. Secondly, it's the value of life not something in life, not the quality of life, which we often get confused with the value of life, but it's life itself. Now, how do you discern the value of life itself as distinct from the quality of life? Well, in one context, particularly, you discern it when you're faced with death. Okay, am I going to live another 10 to 20 years, or am I going to die now? Questions of quality of life aren't terrifically important. They're not the only ones that are important in a context like that, because you're either going to have some life or you're going to have none. Now, because it's discerned most clearly, I wouldn't say only, in contrast with death. It's a longer, complicated problem. But it's discerned most clearly in a contrast with death, and therefore it is directly related to the badness of death. Subjective value of life is the value to the person of what she would lose in death. And the subjective badness of death, we could have the counterpart term, is the loss of subjective value of life in death, from death. Now, this puts what I'm talking about in terms of the subjective badness of death and the subjective value of life basically in the deprivation account, or what some people call the counterfactual family of theories of the badness of death. It's the life I'm deprived of. That's why death is bad. Now, another start, that's just conceptually what I'm taking subjective value of life to be. A second point for me to get clear at the beginning, I call anchoring cases. And I have two cases here that whatever theory I'm going to come up with about the substantive elements in the subjective value of life, they have to pass these two tests. They have to be able to handle these two cases. The first anchoring case is this. Death is not a greater loss at age 0, that is at birth, than at age 20. That is, death to the person who dies is not a greater loss at 0 than at 20. So we're talking about the subjective value of life, or the subjective badness of death. Compare a person dying at birth instead of living to their expected age of 80 with that person dying at 20 instead of living to their normal age of 80. Which death is worse for that person? Now, if you said it's the time in life that is lost is the subjective value of life, then dying at 20 is worse, is dying at 0 is worse than dying at 20 because you lose 80 years. But to the person who dies, dying at birth is not as bad as dying at 20. Right? This drives Jeff McMahan's introduction of the term time relative interest. And we'll get to that later. So dying at 20 is worse in terms of the subjective value of life that's lost by dying at 20 than dying at birth. If whatever theory I come up with doesn't handle that, it's a bad theory. Second anchoring case. The equal value of life. Compare. Person B, this is an interpersonal comparison. Person B with paraplegia dies at 40 instead of living normally to 80. Person C with no disabilities dies at 40 instead of living to her expected age of 80. Which death is worse? B's for B or C's for C? I stubbornly insist that the two are equally bad for B and C respectively. Compared to death, B's life with paraplegia, even if B would be willing to give up some of her life to get cured of paraplegia, even if she were willing to do that, B's life with paraplegia has no less value for her, it's the only life she has, than C's life without disability has for her. And if you imagine B and C talking with each other, and one says, and C says to B, well, you losing your life at 40 isn't as bad as my losing my life at 40. Really? And it is true, the value of what's lost, the badness, the loss of life, of the value of life is equal, even if we would take some risk to cure the disability. That's actually I wrote a paper. That's a longer potential, but that's another anchoring point. Now this illustrates the role of varying reference points, and that will become important later. Okay, substantive. This is not the concept of the subjective value of life. This is the substance. A list of the basic substantive elements of the subjective value of life. My current position is that there are three basic elements. The all-of-life aspect, or life comparative account, who the Norheim and colleagues call it, other people call it by some other names too. It's the subjective value of all the time segments of my life. It's also referred to, I refer to it as time in life. It's close to the value of life as individual utility in the utilitarian and utilitarianism that is used in economics tradition, roughly. The second component, also very crucially important, can't do without it, is time relative interest. This has been developed by Jeff McMahan paradigmatically. A newborn infant's time relative interest in its likely 80-year life is almost zero compared with its all-life value of its life of 80 years, or how many other years it would live. Huge difference. Reference point effects. In life with a disability, for example, you see the role of a different reference point. This is the only life I have. It's as valuable to me as your non-disabled life is to you, even if I'd be willing to take some risk, a shorter life, to get a cure. It's also in the end-of-life premium issue in the National Institute of Clinical Effectiveness in Britain. Nice. Somewhat surprisingly to conventional health economists, the British have acknowledged the importance of what they call an end-of-life premium. In the last year of life, a therapy that can keep you alive for that year, even though it will not be more than a year, is worth more than a therapy 30 years earlier that would keep you alive for 30 years per year. The 30-year saving is not 30 times the value of the 1-year saving, when the 1-year saving occurs at the end of life. Because the reference point is, well, you've only got 1 year at most anyhow. Your whole reference point has changed. That's why the per year value goes up. I think that's very common sense. I think it doesn't, we don't have to do even an awful lot of empirical research to verify. I could be wrong about that. Now, the all-of-life aspect, a little more detail here. It's for the total duration of the prospective life, or looking retrospectively, it's the total duration of the past life. It's an aggregate of the subjective value of all the segments. We could get involved in, well, what are the segments? Years, months, stages of life. I sort of clock my segments, and well, it was a 5-year start in my professional career, and then there was a 10 years after I first got married, and you know, I block it off in like 7 segments, not 62 years since I became a teenager, etc. So we could, but I just say it's an aggregate of the subjective value of each of every segment. It's the value of each segment, though, that may be adjusted for diminished quality. For any adjustment, however, only judgments made by the person whose life it is may be used, because that's required to be consistent with subjectivity of value. It's intuitively strong. The life, that is this all-of-life element, to put into the subjective value of life, because the life we may have had, as valued by the person whose life it is just part of the way we think about our lives subjectively. We are forward-looking people. We have conceptions of our whole life. Now the problems for the AOL element as a complete view are that the loss when an infant or fetus dies compares to a 20-year-old. If it's the only element, then the loss of subjective value is greater for the infant who dies than for the 20-year-old who dies. But in terms of subjective value of life, the value of life to the person who loses it, that doesn't seem to be true. You could also take other examples. The loss when an 80-year-old dies compared to when a 20-year-old dies, both would otherwise have lived to 85, say. The ratio of their losses is not 65 to 5, that is 85 minus 20, which is 65 to 1, and 85 minus 80, or 5 for the other. The ratio is much lower than 65 to 5. The ratio of their subjective value of life is lost. So you need to add some reference point effects and perhaps time relative interest. Time relative interest, so we get to that. I mentioned it before in relation to the infant compared to the 20-year-old dying. At any point in time, psychological relationships connect the current self with later experiences. That's a fundamental fact about the human mind. Now, those connections might not be all that strong. They can be very strong. They can be, in some cases, very weak. But there are psychological relationships that connect the current self with later experiences. These relationships explain rational, egoistic concern for later life. If we don't see some things in the future as our life, the life of the same person I am now, we wouldn't have egoistic concern for our futures. These relationships explain the rational, egoistic concern for later life, that is, of our future at this time. Time relative interest in our future survival is a function of the strength of those psychological relationships and of our current attitudes toward later life. It's not just how strongly we identify with the person we're going to be later, but it's what we think now about the life of that later person. Is it good or bad? Is it horrible or great? So it's a function of both, the strength of the relationships and our attitudes toward the future life. In late fetus or newborn, time relative interest is very low. Later, it's much higher. Take a 20-year-old. Well, some people say, oh, 20-year-olds don't care much about that era. That's why they're so foolish. Well, how about a 30-year-old? Well, 30-year-olds are foolish too. 50-year-olds, maybe they're over the hill and don't care much about their future life because they've made it already. Or what more can I achieve? So, I mean, there are all kinds of things that come into play. But in midlife, I'll just say roughly, 12 for sure, 12 to 70. Time relative interest in your future is very high. Later, it's much lower again. In severe dementia, when you can't even expect tomorrow. You don't have the capacity to expect tomorrow. And when you get to tomorrow, you don't have the capacity to remember yesterday. So to you, what is the value of your survival? If you can't anticipate tomorrow, and when you get to tomorrow, you can't remember yesterday, in what sense can you be said to value your survival? Well, there's still some present appreciation of life, even if it's momentary consciousness, but it's not much subjective value of life, because the time relative interest that you have in your life is so low. Even if you might live 5 years as a relatively happy, extremely demented person who can't expect tomorrow, but sort of seems to be happy. I've written about that too. That's another whole thing. Now, The case for putting time relative interest in the subjective value of life as a full package is not only that it's needed to handle the comparison between the person who dies at birth compared to the person who dies at 20, which loses the most subjective value of life. It's not the infant, it's the 20-year-old. You have to handle that problem. That's why TRI has to be in the package. But intuitively, you can marshal another argument. In death, the actual being who incurs the loss is the person at the time of the loss. Here's Epicurus slipping in. There is no person later. Where then would the value lost, value to a person, be located? It wouldn't be located anywhere. So subjective value has to be value from a temporal perspective. It could be argued. This certainly is strong reason to put TRI in the subjective value of life. But I would also argue that it can't exclusively comprise it. If it did, less subjective value would be lost when D, a person dies at birth with a 40-year life expectancy otherwise, than if that person survived at birth but died at 40, as was expected. If they die at 40, they're still going to feel like the loss is big, even if there's no biological way they could have lived longer. We certainly don't want to say that there's less value lost when the person dies at 40 than when the person, dies at 0 than when the person dies at 40. Time relative interest is higher in the latter case. It's very low for the infant who dies. And yet we don't want to say that alone makes the loss of the one greater than the other. Surely more of, well, we do want to say that it goes in the opposite direction. More of the person's subjective value of life is lost if she dies at 0. Remember, this is a context where she couldn't have lived past 40 anyhow. TRI does not have to be the only element in the subjective value, however, because you could keep the all of life value, especially if all the segments of the all of life aspect of life, subjective value of life, are themselves subjectively valued by the person whose life they are at the times those segments occur. Now, subjective value of life, I will argue, however, not just because of the previous point, but still includes all of life element. People are forward-looking enough that they realize that the value to life to them of future time is not likely captured by just their current time-relative interest in survival. I see ahead of me my next 55 years. I'm 25 years old. But wait a minute. I know, if I'm a reasonable person, I know that I cannot see the full value of that 55 years. I know that now. And so even as a person who's trying to tell you what my time relative interest in my 55-year future is, my likely 55-year future is, I'm going to recognize that I can't capture it all. My current time relative interest will not capture it all. So I, even right now, subjectively, are going to say, you got to put in that future stuff. But you won't know what it is until we get there. That's the all of life element, the time in life element. So I think that time in life, or all of life element, is itself a subjective value. Both because it's subjectively valued at each of its times, its segments, if it's, we're talking about the all of life subjective value, and because even in the most narrow sense of subjective value, what is the life value to you now you've got to put that in. Reasonable people will put that in. From the vantage point of the current moment, the all-of-life element may seem objective and external. Derek Parfit makes this major point, disturbing point. But the all-of-life element is itself subjective. If the value of its segments is thoroughly the value to the person whose life those segments comprise, I would argue. So it legitimately goes in the subjective value of life. Now the third element, reference point effects, is perhaps the briefest and easiest to understand. Disability and chronic illness. Earlier estimates by people of their prospective quality of life from disease and disability typically arise when they actually live with the condition and adapt. They remain willing to trade some time in life for a cure, for example, but not nearly as much as before they adapted. We know that empirically. There's some interesting cases that appear to contradict that. Retrospective after, if they were to get cured after they'd adapted, then that raises another whole set of interesting issues, but basically, disability and chronic illness are illustrations of the reference, how a changed reference point changes the value that people put on their lives. And end-of-life premium, as I noted, is a reference point effect. When my reference point is, well, I've only got a year of life to live anyhow, a year of life becomes much more valuable to me than if I've got 30 years of life to live. And by having a preventive treatment now, I can change my prospects from dying likely at 28 to dying at 28 years from now to dying at 30 years from now. Those 2 years added at the end of 28 to make it 30 are not as valuable as 1 year added when it's either 1 year or nothing. Other reference point effects, short lives compared to long. I had to wrestle with this when my late wife died at 65, which she was just beginning grandmotherhood, and the whole family had to wrestle with Grandma Sue. My God, what a short life. She died at 65. Well, from another point of view, 65, my God, what a long life. Or I had I was very close to a student in her family who died at 22, a month after she graduated. From a long chronic illness, actually. And we had to wrestle with this question, what is the value of Heather's life? She only had 22 years. Well, if you're only going to have 22 years, but it's the only life you have, that 22 years to that person is huge. It's the universe to them. The 65-year-old grandmother, early grandmother, who would like so much more, many more years of grandmother in the family. That's huge. I mean, the 65-year-old life is not a small life. So if you're only going to have 65 years, that 65-year life to you is as valuable as if you're only going to have 85. How can I argue if I'm going to live to 85, 10 more years than I am now, roughly, how can I argue that that life was better to have preserved 20 years ago than the life of a person who would have died 5 years ago? Wait a minute. Really? I'm going to say that because I can live to 85 and you can only live to 70, that my life's more valuable than yours? Death is the great equalizer, as has been said. We could also look at it prospectively for 20-year-olds. I'll leave that one for now. Okay, that's the first break. That's my positive theory.
Good, so we'll break down questions now.
Sorry, I didn't flip forward to the short lives here. That is, subjective value of life, meaning the value of life to the person whose life it is comprised of an all-of-life component, the subjective value of all the segments of life that would be lost or retrospectively has been lived, and the time relative interest in life at a particular point where it might be lost, or perhaps, as we'll see backward looking, it could be backwards. And reference point effects affect both the all-of-life component and the time relative interest component.
Good. Dave?
Thanks.
Good.
For your day.
You're recognizing people out.
How about you kick off and then we'll take your next sentence.
Great. So you talked about you have your time relative interest in life, and then you say, okay, but because I'm very uncertain about the kinds of interests that I'm going to have and the sort of life that I'm going to lead, I have to also account for a sort of all of life interest in thinking about the total subjective value of my life to me, in addition to the reference point effects. Couldn't the all of life interest also, you talked a lot about putting the all of life interest in, but couldn't taking all of life interest into account, could that same reasoning support taking some value out of your life? You say, right now, I'm looking at the next 50 years, and I sort of want them, but I don't know if things are going to get much worse, and they might, so maybe I should just sort of temper the two, such that my all of life, there's both a negative and a positive component, and they sort of come out in the wash, and I end up with my overall valuation of my life being closer to the time-weighted value than it would be if you were only sort of adding in sort of all-life consideration.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'll mention later that time relative interest can be backward-looking as well, and that really kind of roughs things up. Yes, it could be that we overestimate. If we take my time relative interest now at, say, the age of 25, in my likely rest of my life, which is, say, life expectancy is 80, now what do I see in that? There are a lot of things I don't see, and therefore don't value. It's not easy for a 25-year-old to value grandparenting. They don't even know whether they're going to have kids yet. And yet, many of them will, and many of them will be grandparents, and many of them, not all, will love the stage of their life in which they're grandparents. As long as they don't have the kids for more than 7 days. But you're pointing out that we have myopic views of our future, and we overestimate. So I don't want to put, but wait a minute, that wouldn't mean I wouldn't put in the all of life elements. I'm going to get there and I'm going to live through them, so they've got to be there, because I know that I'm going to be that same person. Now, if I were so disintegrated as a personality that I couldn't even identify with my futures at all, Parfit raises that question. Then yes, then we'd have a problem. But if I'm identifying with my futures at all, then whether it's going positive or negative, I'm going to want to put in those all of life segments, right?
I'll come back to it later if we have time.
Sorry.
Second, David.
Yeah, mine's a more fundamental question. So just why do you believe that the person whose life it is the best arbiter for their subjective value of life? Because I can think of situations where perhaps you might have somebody who is suffering from severe mental illness, and they have compromised time, relative interest, they're just they themselves subjectively feel like their life has no meaning, but I could still see how they would be deluded in that assessment, or sort of thinking delusionally in that assessment. And so I don't see why I guess I just would love to hear why you think that
No, it's a very important question. Yeah. Extremely important.
I feel like the rest of the argument is going to rest on that assumption
Yes, we don't let people just value their own lives. Well, wait a minute. We don't. The subjective value of their life is not the only value of their life. There may be certain objective values of their life. There are values of their life subjectively to other people. Those are very important, and whether we encourage them to preserve their life. But we also encourage them to preserve their life if they're depressed, because we believe that they're mistaken about what their future is going to be. But I don't think we can say very hard that they're mistaken about their present. I'm enough of an anti-paternalist that I think a person may even be rationally depressed, or at least a person may be accurately depressed. Now, I would hope that they would avail themselves of all the therapy that might get them out of it, or I would hope that as a friend I could help get them out of it. But who am I to say that, oh, you're not in much pain now? if you're really feeling it, this is a much longer discussion. Paternalism vis-a-vis subjectivity.
Sure.
Admittedly, it's very important. A bigger treatment of this topic would have to pick that up.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm a bit troubled about you argument about dementia. So like if you have a disability and you know you have to die tomorrow, your life would mean a lot to you, even though you can only perceive that you have one day where you remember stuff. And I feel like in the dementia thing, it might be the same. So even though you don't know, you can't foresee your life prospect or your future, and you don't remember your past, how should that mean that your life now to you is valuable? Wouldn't that just make it more intense? So I understand if you get older and you feel like I have a small opportunity set and therefore I don't value life as much. But I just don't see why dementia is a good example for that.
Well, what is the subjective state of mind of the person I'm talking about severe dementia. We're not talking about moderate dementia where the person can't do many of the things that they formerly did. They can't read a chapter of the psychology textbook they wrote or a colleague's criticism of it or whatever. They can't read 2 pages at all. They can't follow a 1-hour TV program. They're in moderate dementia. But severe dementia is much more severe. You ask a person in severe dementia something about tomorrow and they're confused. Tomorrow you ask them about something today and they have no memory. And when you have no expectation and no memory, in what sense can you be said to value your life? Well, you value something. You value the moments. Now, and then we have to go further and say, well, isn't valuing the moments enough to constitute the subjective value of life? And then you'd have to ask, how much do they value the moments? Well, I think without expectation and without memory, they do value the moments. Do they value them much?
It just seems like, for me, that seems to be a matter of the quality of life and not so much about... So if this is only a question of how much do I value my life and not the quality, then, yeah, I'm
But
not sure it's...
contrast that with the reference point example of a person who has only a year of life to live, and that shorter reference point distinctly increases the value of that remaining year of life. There's no reference point effect subjectively to the demented person. What's the positive effect of a different reference point? Oh, I can't expect tomorrow, so I'm really happy with the way it is, not being able to expect tomorrow. No, they're incapable of doing that. So their cognitive level is such that there can be no positive reference point effects for the severely demented person.
We'll take one final question, Jason.
So, first, I just wanted to ask a question about the very beginning intuition pump that you were trying to preserve. So, we're talking about the subjective value of life. On the very first slide, didn't you say that it should be constant between the person at age 0 and the person who, when they were 40? That you were, whatever you think about the subjective value of life, it should be the case that there is the equality. So you begin with the claim about equality on the very first slide.
One of the anchoring cases.
Yeah, one of the anchoring cases.
That was about 2 people who were dying at 40.
There's
Deprived, we could save them from age 40 to 80. But we can put it in a saving
So
line.
it was 0 to 80 or 40 to 80, but it was the case of the subjective value of life.
No, there are various... the subjective value of life of the person who dies at birth instead of living to 80. That's one value. We have to wrestle with what that value is, the subjective value of that life. Compared to the subjective value of life the life that's lost to the person who dies at 20 instead of living to 80.
So the reason I just asked that is because when I think of the life, there seems to be process and product ambiguity in that. And so when you talk about cases like the dementia case, and you say that there's still subjective value for the person in the moment, even though they don't have notions or relational state to the future and the past, that really seems to be focused on like the subjective value of life and the instantaneous subjective process of living. But then all of these other things about like time, relative interest, and so on, seems to be then shifting onto a product notion where you think about the web of interconnections that are built over one's lifespan.
Because that's part of what you subjectively value about your own life.
Yeah, but then my point is that because there's the process-product ambiguity in the subjective value of life, aren't those two really conceptually distinct things that one can...
It could be, yes. It could be that at least time relative interest as subjective value of life, it could be that we can't know how to combine it with the other dimensions of the subjective value of life. I'll get to that. That's part of the reason that I'm worried about what this
I think
account.
right now, let's move on to that.
Okay.
With the part with
Now, I call this refinement. This is the first query. Just what in the hell is time relative interest? I could have titled this more feisty. The usual version is from present looking forward. My 1997 to 27, sorry, I first wrote this in 2017, really 1997 to 2017 life. What would I lose if I died in 1997, judged from the temporal vantage point of 1997? When I die. But why can't time relative interest be backward looking also? Because it's also time relative if it's looking backward, even as much as it's looking forward. What would I have lost if I had died in 1997, judged from 2017? Because from 2017, I can look back on my life and say, geez, I almost lost my life in 1997. Now, from my temporal vantage point, how do I appreciate the last 20 years? That's as much time relative interest in a span of life as time relative interest in 1997 is about my future 20 years. So does time relative interest backward looking as well as forward looking? Now people account for some of the backward looking perspective already in their forward looking time relative interest. Because how interested am I in my 20 years of life that I might live in the future? Well, one of the things I'm going to think about, if I think about it at all, rather than just giving you an instantaneous answer, is, gee, 20 years from now, if I do live that 20 years, how am I going to appreciate those 20 years? That's the backward. So already in forward-looking TRI, people who are reflective are going to include some backward. So I think there's no way out of that. I think TRI's got to be backward looking as well as forward. Now that's not the big problem. By the way, there's a nice phrase I think to capture that, which I don't have on the slide here. Anticipation of retrospective appreciation happens in time relative. Now, more disturbing element is, this is not the most disturbing one, is time relative interest at work within the all of life segments, the time in life segments. Are the subjective values of the temporal segments that get aggregated into all of life also time relative interests? Doesn't all subjective value have to emerge from a temporal perspective? Oh, for 1999, I take it what? The end of 99? Beginning of 99 also? Combination of both. So gosh, all of life is perhaps just time relative interest all the way down, so to speak. Yes, I think there's a strong argument for that. Subjective value so strongly throws us toward time relative interest framework. But even if it is, even if it's time relative interest in the segments that constitute the all of life component of the subjective value of life, the all-of-life component is still an aggregate. It's not an evaluation made from one point in time. The AOL part is therefore not itself a time-relative interest, even if it is an aggregate of time-relative interests. Did I say I'm at this point sort of tentatively happy with that way of answering a question as AOL, TRI all the way down? But here's the bigger problem. The relationship between TRI and AOL. McMahan, Jeff McMahan, who initiated the discussion about time relative interest, he's really to be highly credited for putting a label on it, discerning it as solving a certain kind of problem about the infant compared to the 20-year-old. He speaks of it in two different ways and different points. And my last communication with him is he hasn't made up his mind whether they're both relevant or what exactly. It could be that time relative interest is a discounting factor on all of life. The infant has a TRI of 0.1, virtually nil. It's something. The 20-year-old has a TRI of, say, 0.5. The 20-year-old can be still quite not very appreciative of their future. Therefore, they're reckless. 20-year-olds generally are more reckless. It's actually 75-year-olds like me who should be reckless because we don't have much to lose.
Not on your account.
Yeah, you have everything to do.
Well, yeah, I just caught myself on that. That's not true. It's not true because of the reference point effect. Maybe. Though I don't think I have as much. No, I don't have as much to lose as you do. But at any rate. So running as a discounting factor, 0.01 times an all-of-life value of 1, let's just say that's the value for the rest of life, of the all-of-life element, would then come out 0.01. For the 20-year-old, TRI is 0.5, the AOL is, it's either 0.8 or 0.9. It's not 1 because you're already past the first 20 years, right? It's going to be less than 1 if the all-of-life element is 1 for the infant. Then you multiply the 2 and you get 0.045 or 0.45 or 0.4. You use 0.8 instead of 0.9. But if TRI is an addition to all of life, then what do you do? Well, it would be the infant, 0.01 plus 1 would be 1.01. And the 20-year-old would be 0.50 plus 0.9 for 1.4. Doesn't the addition conception here of the relationship seem better than the discounting one? Intuitively? And yet on what principle would we argue that it should be additional? I don't know how we do that. But furthermore, do we really have any idea what the proportional relationship between the two should be? I've just taken two very simple mathematical relationships here. But what is the proportional relationship between the TRI element and the all-of-life element in the subjective value of life, if both deserve to be there? Now, if both don't deserve to be there, if only one of them is there, we don't have this problem. But I can't see how you can eliminate either one. Now, does the subjective value of life lost have to be the value at the time when the life is lost? The strongest case for the discounting model is the late-term fetus. It may be wrong not to save its life, but does what it loses have really any subjective value to it? But there's also a strong pull toward the additive view, because especially once we get past infancy, we subjectively see whole lives. Okay? So this isn't an easy, I don't see really how you can eliminate either one. The additive view may be correct, but then what proportional relationship holds between them? We still have no clear view of what subjective value of life is. Okay, let's summarize. TRI and AOL are both indispensable elements of subjective value. Variable reference points affect both. Some method is needed to discern the subjective value of the segments comprising all of life. It could be TRI. Both discounting and additive models for TRI-AOL relationship can be defended. The stronger case is for the additive model, which I suspect at this point it is. We still need to know the proportional relationship between the two. Yes, some of subjective value of life structure is clear. It has these three components. But we still confront inherent ambiguity. And with no clear view of what subjective value of life is, how can we measure it? We can't. So what are we doing in health economics? In cost effectiveness analysis? The most important, I don't say the only, the most important value of life is the value of life to the person whose life it is. And we can't measure it. We can do all kinds of questions of the people, and we still can't measure it, because you can't figure out the relationship between TRI and AOL. The reference point effects are pretty clear. We can see the effect of those on both TRI and AOL. But we can't figure out the relationship between TRI and AOL. Do you get my puzzlement here? Okay, that's the next break. I do have something positive to say after this.
Questions at this point? Suzanne?
I have one, I think it relates more to the first part, but I still have the question, I'm just going to answer. It's basically what do you mean by value? And what I hope to clarify by that is also how radical or revisionary your view is compared to the life comparative account or the time relative interest account. So I mean, usually for the LCA or the life comparative account or the TRIA, value basically is net intrinsic goodness. So it's something like, we need a definition of what are goods that make a person's life go better, what are bads that make a person's life go worse. And once we have settled that, basically the value of the life you lose if you die a particular death, according to the life comparative account, you just compare the value of two lives, right? And then you get something like a difference. And for the TRIA, you do a similar thing, but on my understanding, you just discount basically the value that you lose by the extent to which you're not psychologically connected to your future self. So the value thing is just net intrinsic goodness that the life contains. And one way in which you could understand what you're saying so far is something like, keep that like value, it's in the end it's still net intrinsic goodness, but introduce a reference point which leads to some like potentially inflating of that value or discounting of the value, and add the TRIA, which also leads to maybe adding certain things, but value is always net intrinsic goodness, it's just suitably discounted, inflated, etc. But if that's what you're saying, it just doesn't fit with the motivation for this whole investigation, because I mean it relates to Jason's question as well. A lot of what you said is, who are we to say that this person's life, the subjective value would be higher or lower? But even if you do all this adjusting, unless you force it to be the case, there will be different values for different lives. And so maybe you make them more equal than they would otherwise be if you do sufficient like reference points, etc. But it wouldn't yield at all that all lives are equally valuable. And that seemed to be part of the motivation you have.
No, it doesn't. I should have said relatively equal value of lives, or at least relatively equal value of life, not quality, but life, that is life compared to death. When it really is life compared to death for respective people. Now sometimes the choices are not that. I'm also, my language, I don't, you use the word inherent value.
Or intrinsic, yeah.
Or, excuse me, intrinsic, sorry. Intrinsic value. I use subjective value. They're not the same thing.
Yes, that's my question. But you seem to be saying something like subjective value is just suitably discounted and put together intrinsic value.
People may have intrinsic, take your example of the person whose subjective value of life, that is value of her life to herself,
Yes.
is low because of severe depression, long-standing severe depression. And even in conversation and trying to make that judgment that they express genuinely reflective, it still turns out low. We might say the intrinsic value of that person's life is just as great as the intrinsic value of a person who's happy. But the subjective value of their life is not.
But then you can just sum up TRIA and AOL because they both rely on intrinsic goodness. Like you actually
No.
quite radically reform them.
No, the only intrinsic goodness that the subjective value of life account. Remember, it's not the only value of life. There may be intrinsic values separate from subjective value.
Good. But you present them as something like a compound of different accounts.
I'm just
that
trying to
rely on
get straight
intrinsic.
what the value of life to the person whose life it is.
Okay.
That subjectivity of the value of life. What is it? Now we still, even if we got perfectly clear on what subjective value of life was, we'd still have the problem of how to relate it to intrinsic value, how to relate it to other kinds of value that society puts on it, etc. But when I started on this, I thought I was going to get to a point where I could really say what the subjective value of life was, and it would help, give some help in health economics and health benefit measurement, and I end up with a stumper.
We'll take one more question at this point and then keep your question for the end, because I should have added that time is of especially high relative interest to our speaker, who has a unmissable date with his wife at the theater this evening. So we're going to be ending a bit on the early side. Yes?
Okay, so this is a clarificatory question. So is there any necessity to represent TRI as a value in between 0 and 1? Could it be like 1 to 2 and then by multiplying
No.
AOL?
First of all, you have to have a conception of what the range is for AOL. I picked 1 as just, the whole life. And so 60 years of it, if 0 to 80 is the whole life. Going to live 60 years more from 20 to 80, that's 0.9, 0.8. I was very arbitrary there. And so you have to sort of say, what's the scale? The biggest all of life, time in life value, the smallest. It'll be from 0 to something. And you similarly have to say what a minimum and a maximum is for time relative interest.
Paul, I'll ask you to press on with the final part
Okay.
of your talk and leaving us with a bit of discussion at the end.
What then? Inherent, well, here's my proposal. I don't know whether it works in public policy. It's messy. Inherent ambiguity, which is what I claim characterizes the subjective value of life, when we really look at just what it is, not saying, here's how we're going to use it, but what is it? Strong cases can be made for TRI and for AOL. I can't see any way to eliminate either one. TRI is the purely subjective element, to be sure, but values in the AOL account are subjective also. But for the current person, they may seem like external objective facts. On the other hand, the future or past value of AOL segments is still a subjective value of my life, and therefore it's a value to me. And I think we also have to wrestle with the difference between conscious appreciation at a point in time and the whole notion of a whole life, which is not even just the aggregate of the individual segments. There's an arc of life. There's a lot of discussion about this in relation to advanced directives and how stringently we should follow them for people who say, don't keep me alive in a certain situation. When maybe at the time, they're relatively happy in moderate severe dementia. As a person, my mental boundaries span much more than current time. So another reason to put AOL in there. Well, I stipulated that reason earlier. We do not have to choose between these two if we just make clear when any estimate of subjective value of life is made, that is by utilitarians, who typically I think are relying on a notion of subjective value of life, non-paternalistic utilitarians, what perspective and temporal scope is being employed. Now, it won't be so easy for them to state, but at least we'd get rid of some of the ambiguity then. Now, we might achieve that clarity by assigning different roles. Almost by discipline, we could agree to assign different roles to the various elements here. Possibility is, I only say this is a possibility, I'm not sure that we would come to this conclusion if each stage of this is itself going to be highly contested and is highly controversial probably. Number one, at the edges of personal subjective life, TRI should dominate. Late stage fetus, newborn, does not have much subjective value of life at all, despite the fact that there's a lot of AOL in it. That's lost in the death of the newborn. And in end-stage dementia, I think also, the severe drop in time-relative interest in life has a bigger effect than just the relatively small time in life left, even though it's not sometimes terribly small. To the fetus, no sense in which to it the AOL value much matters. Now, there are a lot of other issues that come in here about care of newborns, moral issues. I'm just talking about what the subjective value of life to the fetus is. In severe dementia with little capacity to anticipate, we've gone through that before, and all that's, as you discussed with you and reflecting in your questions, not uncontroversial. Different assigned roles, step number 2. In the primary span of life, not only TRI, but all of a person's time in life matters. Even a short-sighted 20-year-old can be quickly brought to acknowledge that the longer accumulation of time is significant. And they're beginning to have a conception, oh, I have a whole life now. And so AOL readily enters. Any adult looking back will say that it matters. Neither of these claims can be made for the fetus or the severely demented. 3, for aggregate subjective value in a population, AOL should count, though not exclusively. Aggregation, after all, in a population where we're aggregating among different individuals, is itself inherently impersonal. The elements that are aggregated may be personal, intensely personal and subjective, but the aggregation is not personal. There is no person who experiences the aggregate. The aggregate is not subjective to any subject. So if aggregation is inherently impersonal, then the somewhat less purely subjective AOL component should be included for sure, and maybe even dominate in a population aggregate. I'm undecided exactly where to go there. TRI is still needed, though, or the death of a newborn would count as a greater loss in the population aggregate than the death of a 20-year-old. This is McMahan's point. Caveat? Sorry. I've completely forgotten to flip forward in the slides here. Now, maybe population health does not have to be an aggregate of subjective value. It could be some other kind of aggregate. Conclusions. We should acknowledge fundamental ambiguities inherent in subjective value and the difficulties in measuring it that these create. Always account for reference point effects. When a claim about subjective value is made, be clear about the extent to which the main elements of it, TRI and AOL, are included. If within a discipline or subdiscipline the use of a particular version of subjective value becomes conventional practice, a justification should be articulated for why that version is used. With all these difficulties, should we still use subjective value in public policy in regard to life-saving and death prevention and priority setting? Well, yes, in the tradition of non-paternalism, like John Stuart Mill, we should. A primary concern of society should be to increase the good of all individuals, to those individuals. If we don't do that, really, are we respecting persons in the society? What is good for individuals ultimately rests on what they judge to be in their benefit. Health and safety policy, at least, when lives are at stake, should be based in part on subjective value of all individuals affected. So I don't see a way, a justifiable way out of keeping subjective value in even the population aggregate and priority decision-making process. But as you can tell, I don't know where to go. And maybe, you know, this is the philosopher saying, ha! The whole apple cart is tipped over. I don't want to say that. Because I think we have practical ways of maneuvering when we encounter these basic conundrums about, oh, gee, I can't go there, I can't go there. On the other hand, well, sometimes we sit back and say, well, on balance, what would be the best way to do this in public policy? I think, by the way, here, comparative judgments about badness must still be made in value of lives. They should be informed by accurate perceptions of subjective value to the individuals who are affected and should not express social value judgments, interpersonal social value judgments about comparison, that are not in turn informed by those accurately perceived subjective values to the individuals whose lives they are. Caveat, care must be taken with person trade-off, preference data, for example, in relation to that. Understanding better the nature of subjective value does not itself tell us how to use subjective value and preference data in setting program priority. Dan Hausman, for example, doesn't want to use that data, thinks that other data is much more, or the considerations are much more important. To some extent, you don't want to use it, I think. You are emphasizing the egalitarian solidarity issues that we talked about. I'm not sure exactly how you intersect with this, but at any rate, an example of a TRI consideration that has affected a major priorities report is the Disease Control Priorities Second Edition in 2006, in which the burden of disease-caused miscarriages was no longer a straightforward counting of prospective children's lost years of life, as it had been in the previous editions. The reason? The years get greatly discounted because of time-relative interest. Dean Jameson read Jeff McMahan, or an earlier comment Jeff McMahan had read, and Bonnie Steinbach about the status of the fetus and the value of life of the fetus, which she did not say was zero, but took a particular nuanced cut at it, and decided that the previous way they counted all the years of life lost in a miscarriage was wrong in a population aggregate global burden of disease. Direct change in methodology given a perception about the relevance of TRI for a particular matter, the value of life lost in a miscarriage. Okay.
Thank you very much.